everybody. Nice to see so many people here. I think there's still faces coming up on the screen. So welcome to Chain and Tate's Charity Group Seminars for 2021. My name is Ewan Morris and I head up the Charities team at Chain and Tate. Now, last year we were just about to start off on our seminar series, which we normally do at breakfast time. And unfortunately, COVID hit just at the point we were going to start on that. So we had to suspend our events. But this year, what we've decided to do is we have decided to move to holding these online. And we're absolutely delighted to have as our first speakers, Julie Hutchison and Gail Brisbane of Aberdeen Standard Capital. And what we're going to talk about today is charity investments, climate change, and COP26. And I'll let Julie explain a bit more about that later on. Julie is a charity specialist at Aberdeen Standard Capital, and she's extensive experience in the charity sector, and that includes co-authoring OSCR's investment guidance for trustees. And also speaking, Gair is head of charities in Scotland for Aberdeen Standard Capital, and he's worked in the sector, I think, for almost 20 years. We'll just, before we actually kick off with the speakers, we'll just go over some housekeeping points. And the first of these is just for the webinar itself. We're actually going to be recording this, so please feel free to switch off your camera. We're just obviously ask the delegates if you can mute your audio, just to avoid some feedback. If you're wanting to ask questions, we'll have the chat function open. You'll see that little box at the bottom of the screen, hopefully. So just type in questions there as you go along, and we will deal with those at the end. There are breakout sessions which we are going to be holding towards the end of the seminar, and Julie will explain a bit more about those shortly. But it's just to confirm that they won't be recording the breakout rooms. It'll just be the main presentation that we'll be recording. So that's enough from me, and I'll now hand over to Julie to start.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ewan. It's great to be, kicking the year off with a webinar with Chain and Tate. So thanks very much for, inviting us to talk about what will be a fairly important theme as we go through the year, looking ahead at COP26 and this theme of climate change and investments. And just a quick hello from the team before we get into the meat of today. Many of you will recognise some of the faces on the Rogues Gallery here. Top left is Mike Connor, who heads up our Edinburgh office, albeit a building we've not been into for about 11 months now. That's myself in the middle, and Gair, top right hand side, who is our head of charities in Scotland. And we'll hear from Gair a bit later on some of the investment aspects. Craig Joyner, bottom left hand side, is also part of the team, and completing the team is Carol Clark. So that's the Rogues Gallery, as I like to call them. And a bit of a running agenda in terms of what we're covering today. We're looking at climate change as the context in COP26. What is it? Why does it matter? I'll be saying a bit about the OSCR regulatory backdrop, what the charity regulator in Scotland's got to say about all of this kind of stuff, and what it means for your investment policy statement. We're then going to look at what some of the spectrum of options for charity trustees are when, in relation to their investments, they make a decision that they want to reflect climate change concerns in their portfolio. We'll then look at some examples of what's called negative and positive screening, and we'll give some illustrations of what that means. And then we'll go into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. I've got a couple of questions to prompt some discussion there. And Q&A is possible throughout. Now, in terms of the chat bar at the bottom, if you want to have a look at clicking that chat bar, it brings up the option for you to type comments in. Feel free to type any questions as we go along, and we'll scoop them up as we reach a later point just before the breakout rooms. Or we might turn to them if that's timely to do so in relation to what we're talking about. So I think that's probably all the technical housekeeping for the moment. And without further ado, I'll get on to a bit of context. Now, we sit here all in our separate rooms with a global pandemic as the backdrop, and you might think, well, why should we be spending time talking about climate change in COP26 when the world is struggling with arguably the biggest crisis it's faced in a century? And I think it's probably worth saying, from our point of view, we are seeing some organisations now reaching a point where they're wanting to start to return to some of that longer term planning and the longer term conversations. We also feel that with what's happening in Glasgow on our doorstep, you know, as charities in Scotland, we can't ignore the fact that the eyes of the world will be on us in November, come what may, in relation to this COP26, which is the Conference of the Parties, the UN big conference on climate change. And so among the many, many things that charity boards will be juggling with this year in terms of short-term pressures, medium-term priority setting, and a long-term outlook, we felt an opportunity to talk about something else in the mix of all that's going on at the moment. And in terms of the Scotland context, you know, I find this is less of an issue now, but in perhaps a historic comment point, in years gone by, it was perhaps the case that sometimes organisations weren't making the connection with climate change and the Scotland impact of that. You know, in a global context, when we talk about global heating or other global impacts of climate change, that was perhaps easier to identify. But for anyone who's interested in a particularly Scottish dynamic to this, you see the report that's on screen there, the first Scottish Climate Change Adaptation Programme, that lists all sorts of very Scotland-specific impacts and outcomes, one of which I picked up on in relation to Edinburgh and projected sea level rise of between 20 and 40 centimetres by around 2090. So interesting sometimes to really bring this down into a local context and understand what's being said about the modelling and how this impacts us, because that then can sometimes help with that conversation about, well, what's the impact on us as an organisation? Okay, so that's a bit of context. That's a bit of what's coming up in November with this large gathering of the 197 countries who are going to be recommitting to new, what's called nationally determined contributions. What are the goals that they're going to be setting themselves in terms of their carbon outcomes? And the regulatory backdrop. So from a charity point of view, you know, what we see at Aberdeen Standard Capital, if I rewind the clock to 2015 and the run up to the Paris Climate Agreement, there were only a small handful of charitable organisations that had any really meaningful commentary on environment and climate matters in their investment policy statement. Fast forward now, 2021, and the dominant conversation, the request for support that we're hearing from our clients is, how do we reflect sustainability, environment, or climate change concerns in both our investment portfolio, but also our investment policy? And the reason it begins with a policy conversation is because of this particular document, which I still have a physical copy of, managed to grab one last March before we went home. And this is the OSCR Charity Investment Guidance, which came out in 2018. I was one of the co-authors to that, so I have quite a good understanding of the process that went into the creation of the document. And for charity trustees in Scotland who were thinking about, well, what does the regulator have to say about how I should approach charity investments and the way in which we might as trustees have a policy that either excludes certain things or deliberately includes certain things? Well, this is your reference document. You can find it easily Googling to find that on their website. And the key reference point is in section 5, the bit that talks about what else should you think about before investing. And that looks about this question of how to align your investments to your charity's purposes. Now, I know we've many different people in the webinar today, many different types of organisation represented. But this question of alignment, sometimes people get a bit twitchy with this idea of ethics. You know, well, whose ethics should be reflected in the charity? Is it my ethics? Is it somebody else's ethics? Sometimes taking the E word out of it is a way to tackle this in a slightly more productive way. And this question of alignment, I think, drills down more closely to really the nub of it when it comes to charity matters, because thinking about hospice organisation, that's often an easy example to identify a body that wouldn't invest in tobacco, for example. But when it comes to the climate side of things, what we've seen over the last 18 months or so are organisations which have a youth focus, that have children and young people as beneficiaries, really leading the way in adapting their investment policy statement to include an exclusion in relation to what might be called fossil fuel companies or oil and gas companies. And the rationale that we're seeing those organisations take there is in relation to the view that their beneficiary group are the ones that are going to be most impacted by the impacts of climate change with the years that they have ahead of them. In another case, we've seen a health organisation take the view that they wish to make that same exclusion, include that in their policy, because they feel that air pollution is now beginning to be at such a critical issue for them, particularly in relation to child health and asthma, for example, that that's an exclusion they want to make. And we've seen in England and Wales a coroner making a finding about air pollution being a contributory cause to child mortality. So we know this is an increasing area of focus and the linkages are being made. Equally, there's an international development charity that we're working closely with. And again, they apply climate-related exclusions. So there's all sorts of different ways of looking at this where charities are making that link between this is who we are, this is the charitable purposes we have, and we therefore feel as a matter of alignment that that's the approach we're taking. So all of that, you can find references in section 5, and indeed some of the case studies at the back of the guidance elaborate on those themes a little further. Now, the spectrum of choices, you know, we're very clear, you know, when Gera and I are talking to charity clients about this, it's not a question of us saying this is what you should do. It's for each group of trustees to come to that collective view where they're sharing a decision on the approach they want to take. And for us, it's about illustrating the art of the possible. What are the stopping off points on a spectrum of choices that you might want to consider? So this bubble slide, as I call it, gives you an illustration of where we see things at the moment. And based on research that we carried out tail end of last year, maybe even end of, tail end of 2019, I should say, around half of charities aren't applying any specific screens at the moment. Around a third of charities, the orange bubble, do apply one or more screens, whether that be the classic tobacco, weapons, alcohol, gambling, or indeed fossil fuel coming in there. You then see about 8.5% organisations really focusing in on this divestment question, divestment being the act of no longer investing in a sector, and in this case being divestment from the fossil fuel industry, that being something in particular that universities have been very active in. Again, back to that point I was mentioning earlier about having a beneficiary population that's focused on young people. And finally, the 7.3%, where impact investing is where they've decided to go. Now, impact investing or positive investing is something Gera will expand on a little later on. But this is a newer way, really, of looking at things that's less about what you're screening out and more about how you're tilting and focusing on certain sectors for the future and that lower carbon transition that we're in the middle of, and much is yet to be seen in that. That really sits behind a lot of what we're seeing there and that Gera will expand on. So that's the picture, that's what the spectrum looks like. But even for the 50% or so of charities that don't have ethical screens, you know, from our point of view, there are still things going on under the bonnet that mean the environment is not ignored within a charity's investment portfolio. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. One other aspect to this, and it will come up in the breakout rooms for you to consider, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So all 17 of them, these are identified as the 17 things that we most need to focus on at a global and local level between now and 2030. And I've seen a number of organisations look not just in a narrow sense at this to say from an investment point of view, what should or should not we be doing in relation to climate and our investment, but actually taking a more holistic approach and saying, what could we do as an organisation to have a positive impact across our operations? What should our sustainability policy be? And within that, a slice of answering that question might be investment related, but that takes a much more holistic angle. And, you know, I do think that may be worth pursuing for those organisations that want to take a fresh look at their policy in that area. It does also translate into investments, and Gera will say a bit more about some of that later on. But back to this 50% of charities that don't have any specific commentary on climate or environment themes from an investment point of view. What we have going on under the bonnet for charities who are with us and don't have any specific environment or climate related streams, there are nevertheless a number of things going on under the bonnet which point to positive activity in relation to environmental outcomes. And what I mean there is that environmental, social and governance factors, what's called ESG, is something that goes on as part of normal investment research with investment portfolios with us. So looking at what this means from our point of view, we're not kind of Johnny-come-latelys when it comes to this sort of way of looking at the investment world. Going back to 1992, we had colleagues who were in the corporate governance team that was established at that point and starting to look at this whole question of how do we look at good corporate behaviour? How do we look at companies who are not damaging the local communities they're operating in and looking at minimising their environmental impact? So this whole timeline shows how this area has evolved over almost 30 years now, and pointing in particular to 2007, where we were one of the founding signatories of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. You might say, well, what's that? Why does that matter? Well, the UN PRI, as it's called, is a global way, in a way of signalling best practice. It's a way of showing that you're spending time and resource researching the risks and the opportunities related to environment, social and governance points within your investments. And it was pleasing to see last year that we were rated ourselves A+ in 6 areas that the UN PRI assessed us on. So a number of different things that have happened over the years there, really just illustrating the point that this is not just a sort of recent trend. For those of you who are interested in more content, whether that be a podcast, whether that be looking at some reports or joining forthcoming webinars in the Climate Action series, the Aberdeen Standard Investment website has got a number of resources and things you might want to sign up to, and a few of them are shown on screen just now. Now, taking an extract actually from the document there on the left, the quarterly ESG report, every quarter our responsible investment team colleagues put together a snapshot summary of a number of the different areas of work that they've been involved with over the last quarter. And something which I'm drawing out here is, again, not to do with screening, it's to do with what's going on under the bonnet in every investment portfolio that we're involved with. And you see the pie chart on the left, the circle, and around about 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock there, you see 9.8% indicated and 8.9%, and that's climate change and environment respectively. What that means is in the company meetings that have been happening, and by that I mean our responsible investment team, our investment colleagues, meeting the companies that we're invested in on behalf of our clients and raising issues to do with climate change, the metrics, the measurements, the risks, actions being taken operationally. 8 and 9% being climate and environment, that's the degree to which those themes are being actively raised and covered during engagements. And that's all about being an active shareholder, trying to influence the companies we're invested in towards better outcomes. Now, the other half of being an active shareholder is on resolutions and voting. And we report on that, again, you can see every quarter. So in Q3 2020, we voted on over 11,000 resolutions, and not always just being what you might call the yes man. You see percentage of resolutions voted against and percentage of abstention. So this is going on under the bonnet, not always well known, and really I think it's quite important to raise the visibility of this, because this goes some way to providing reassurance that environment and climate matters are on the table, being discussed and actively raised with companies that we're invested in. In addition to that, from an Aberdeen Standard Capital perspective, we're part of the broader PLC that is Standard Life Aberdeen PLC. And a number of things, I won't draw on all of them here, but you see the top right hand side, PawPrint, the Eco Companion. This is an app you can download. They've got a website as well. It allows you to measure your own carbon footprint. I'm going to do this myself to see to what extent the fact that, I've still got a gas boiler, as many of us do. These sorts of things we can actually drill down to. Instead of thinking about CO2 emissions on a global basis, we can think about what does this mean about me, and in the fullness of time, the travel choices I make about holidays. Do I or do I not take flights? Am I eating meat every day or having some meat-free days? All these sorts of things that impact personally our own impact on the environment. Really quite interesting to see the calculations that PopPrint then gives you as to your own CO2 footprint, an estimate obviously, but quite an interesting experiment to do. You see ESG and in ESG investing there. You know, Ger was one of the first in our firm to complete that particular qualification. And the fact that this is now seen as, from a professional point of view, an area of education in its own right, I think is a signifier of how mainstream environmental, social and governance matters come. A couple of logos in the bottom right-hand corner, again, collaborations that we're part of, working with other investment managers in this area. But something I draw attention to on the bottom left-hand side is engagement is all about the, you might say, behind closed doors discussions that we have with the companies that we invest in. If we feel that those discussions are not achieving the outcomes that we need to see, eventually we may go public and call for certain things, knowing that that publicity could have a certain impact on the company we're invested in. And that's exactly what we did with BHP Billiton, large mining company, just over a year ago, where we called them out on the fact that they had said on the one hand that they're working towards compliance with emerging global climate standards, yet at the same time, they were still paying to be a member of an industry body, a lobbying organisation that was promoting use of coal. And the contradiction between those two positions was something that we felt could not continue. So you see, that is an example of where we'll go so far with engagement and then potentially go public if we feel that engagement is not being effective. So that's a bit of an overview on what ESG means, about what being an active steward means in terms of engagement and voting and coalitions with others in the sector and being public in the voice we have, calling companies out. And I'll now hand over to Ger, who's going to talk a bit more about negative screening, what that means in terms of the charities we're working with, particularly when we have a charity that comes to us and says, right, I'm worried about fossil fuels or excluding that from my portfolio. What does that actually mean, and what are the choices available to me? So over to you, Ger.
Thanks, Julie. So Julie has talked about climate change and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So these are clearly just some of the considerations that may be of interest to investors. Investing responsibly, and Julie alluded to this beforehand, that the difference between ethics and alignment. Investing responsibly is a personal journey for each charity, and what is considered ethical is likely to vary between charities depending on their charitable objectives. If invested in a single fund, that's clearly a bit more difficult because there are no opportunities to customize screening. But if invested in individual stocks, or what we would call a segregated portfolio, then there is a large array of restrictions available. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, this is just a screenshot. We use MSCI's ESG Manager. Julie was just talking about the environmental, social and governance. So this is a management tool which helps with the screen of that. It's a hugely powerful tool that provides additional company research on top of what we do ourselves, but also it creates an electronic trading block so that if we try to buy something which runs contrary to our clients' restrictions, then it simply prevents us carrying out that trade. The screens put in place can be conduct-based, such as being involved in activities which negatively impact the natural environment or cause a loss of habitat or biodiversity. Or they'd be sector-based, and this is often the case where we're simply excluding an entire sector, such as oil, miners, or armaments. The image to the right talks about this, but so it is quite a complex subject, and this just looks at one sector by itself, carbon and fossil fuels. Now you can see below that you've got all these subsectors, and there are numerous ones of those. But even just teasing out one of those, you can see the blown out box to the right. Each one of those then has multiple additional criteria that can be selected. So it can be quite a challenging issue and quite confusing journey for our charity boards to navigate, but we're very much on hand to support discussions and help charities find what is most appropriate for their needs. Julie, if you go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that investments tend to be either in a pooled fund or customized, what we call a segregated portfolio. We tend to find that the latter, the segregated option, is the most cost-effective method for running a portfolio, but this is not the only benefit. Customized portfolio gives complete control over content. For example, I still do the dealing myself, so I know what is in all of my client portfolios, and I've got complete control over that. So it means that if ethical restrictions are added, we can do so with integrity and give greater confidence to charities, especially when they're seeking to utilise ethical restrictions to protect their reputation. On the right of the slide, you can see just 2 of the reports available to us. These are very comprehensive and allow us to interrogate companies reporting back breaches of restrictions to provide context. So one example was actually fairly recently, one of my clients had a restriction. They wanted to block out companies with poor track records of health and safety. And as it happened, a company which I really liked, it's all about renewable energy, they had a health and safety breach where somebody working on servicing a wind turbine got electrocuted and had a fall. Now, they had other safety equipment in place, so they didn't fall far, they had the tagline. But also, when I look back at it, although it was a breach of the client's restrictions, it was the only breach on health and safety grounds at all in the last 3 years, and it's done on a 1-3-year basis. So I felt that it was, rather than selling straight away a company which was very much in line with the client's wishes and a single isolated breach, that what I do instead is monitor that over the next 6 or 12 months and see if that isolated case becomes more recurring, in which case that's a different story. But we've got the ability to do that, and we've got the discretion to look at this and put local context around it. That owning individual companies also allows us to engage with the management, which adds to our desk-based research, both on financial matters, but also for management matters such as executive pay, environmental practices, or social engagement with local communities. And by having a deeper understanding of companies, we believe we're better placed to invest for the long term and positively influence corporate behaviour. Julie mentioned about the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, and that is one of the things we've signed up to in the public declaration about, that we will actively engage with companies to try and drive forward better corporate behaviour. And when we can't do it by ourselves, we'll join forces with others and bring about that change we want to see. Go to the next slide, please, Julie. So there's an investment spectrum which has conventional non-screened portfolios at one side, where the objective is really financial returns at all costs. And then on the other side, you've got impact investing, which targets societal change as a priority over financial returns. But as it is with a spectrum, we recognise there'll be clients at every stage across this. The majority of charities we tend to find are somewhere around the middle. There's certainly been an increase in charities looking to align their investment portfolios with the United Nations SDGs. Our approach to that is that of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, we distill them into 5 pillars. And that first teal row you see are those 5 pillars. So how we source and power, how we build, how we transport, how we make and use, and how companies operate. We then grouped products and services under each respective heading and use this to pick companies which we believe offer best-in-class solutions to tackle issues facing us today, while also seeking financial returns over the long term. So as you can see, there's a variety of solutions available, and it can be quite confusing, but we'd invite you to come and speak with us. It's what Julie and I are doing all day, every day, myself on the investment side and Julie on the governance and policy side. We'd be delighted to help support your board discussions and help work towards finding an investment solution which is cost effective, invests for integrity, and helps protect your reputation. Now, Julie, I'll hand back to you to move towards the breakout rooms.
Great, and I should just say, just in case anyone's wondering, I'm not sitting in 6 St Andrews Square today, notwithstanding the backdrop I have. You know, the power of technology allows Zoom backdrops, so I just happen to have one that makes it look like that's where I am, but believe me, I am sitting in my kitchen at the moment. There's a couple of questions for prompts, but what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen just briefly and come back and just see in case there are any questions. So I'd invite you for a moment or two, if any of you have got any questions or things you'd like us to clarify or expand on, do take the opportunity to type them in, and we will come back to them after the breakout room. I don't think there's any questions at the moment, so what I'll do is I'll go back to, there were 3 prompts for the conversation for the breakout rooms that we're about to commence. It might be that you want to talk about whether climate change is on your agenda yet with your charity, whether that be in an investment context or otherwise. The question you might want to talk about is, do you have a broader sustainability policy? You know, does your sustainability policy still largely focus on the amount of recycling that you're doing in an office environment, which even at the moment, of course, may not be the most relevant focus for it? Or are you a membership organisation? What's the picture with member engagement on this issue? Have you had representations from staff or indeed donors in relation to climate change issues in your organisation? And what's that prompting? So these are 3 possible questions you might want to talk about. It's also a chance just to say hello and have a bit of an informal chat for the next 10 minutes. And you'll see shortly, with full thanks to Stuart at Sheen & Tate, who's doing all the wizardry with Zoom and the breakout rooms, an invitation to join a breakout room. Please click accept, and then you'll get a timer countdown to bring you back to the main room in about 10 minutes time. So we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. That's all right. Thanks, Stuart. Well, so far so good on the tech side. You know, I think we got into the breakout rooms for a bit of a chat, and we're back now. Just wanting to check in case anyone's wanting to type any question they want to ask into the chat bar. Anything that came up during your breakout session, or just anything you want to share. You know, now would be a good time to do so. We are moving towards 12 o'clock, which was our promised end time, so we won't overrun. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's starting to think about lunch as the immediate next thing I will be doing once I get all my the Zoom side of things completed. But just thinking about some of what we covered in our breakout room, it was interesting how quickly we got into broader discussions about the operational aspects of the charity and how things like the carbon associated with your office footprint. Well, if you're going to be occupying a smaller office in future, as was one of the examples in our discussion, then, you know, that smaller office, it may be running more efficiently, depending on how you source your energy. You know, that has its own implications too. And with people traveling less, maybe longer term as well, not every meeting will involve having to physically meet in person. That also has a consequence. So I'm not seeing any questions coming in on the Q&A, so nothing that we need to attend to there. Final chance to do so if there's any final burning questions anyone wants to ask. I will therefore just move to some final thanks from us. So if any of you would like to follow up, Ger mentioned that online workshops are something that we've become quite accustomed to doing. You know, the charities that we typically tend to work with have investments around about £1 million plus, but not all of them do. Not all of them are quite that large. But we are very happy to have a chat. So get in touch with us at charities@aberdeenstandard.com. For those of you that like using Twitter, the social media side of things, the 2 handles are shown there. And, you know, we'd be delighted to continue the conversation that we've started today on all of this. And that's the really exciting compliance information that I'm always obliged to disclose. So with that, I'll hand back to Ewan, who I think's got a few comments and remarks that to make for closing. Ewan.
Thanks, Julie. Well, firstly, just to thank Julie and Ger very much for that presentation. It was really interesting, very informative. And I think, as I was saying in the breakout session that I was in, we've seen discussions about ethical investment over the years, and it's certainly something that's grown in significance and importance, both in sort of media presentations like this, but we also see it in our own clients, a definitely increasing focus on it. So it's really important that we get an understanding of the issues involved, and we know that there's places to go to get that sort of advice, that it's not, there is a way to get a better understanding of it, and there is a route to best advice on that. And thank you to everyone for attending as well. It was great to see so many of you here. There's a bit of an unusual format for us at Sheen & Tate, but I think it's going well today. And we do have a number of events coming up in the future over the next 2 or 3 months. We've got digital transformation, which is maybe helping out with how to make your ledgers a bit better, working in the online world that we are now, how to access financial expertise, and making grant applications. So these are some of the topics that you'll be hearing more about us for future online events such as this. So thank you very much, and goodbye.